Mr. Noisy. Hello everyone, I am Ian. Today I am going to read you one Mr. Man book. It is called Mr. Noisy. Mr. Noisy was a very noisy people indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice was a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But a tissue, when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now the story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. A sound more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who live in Warwater, which at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had go to shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He went into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. "I like a loaf of bread," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Crumb, the banker's wife. Mr. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. "I'd like a piece of meat," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon grinned and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mr. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy," she said. "Absolutely," replied Mr. Bacon. "But what?" "I know," said Mr. Crumb, as she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. "Mr. Crumb," he said, "I think you have the answer." The following day, Mr. Noisy went shopping again. Clump, clump, clump. He went to Mr. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "Sorry, what do you say?" asked Mr. Crumb, pretending not to hear. "I'd like a loaf of bread," Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mr. Crumb. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, replied Mr. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went to Mr. Crumb's house. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mr. Crumb. Mr. Noisy shouted at the voice. A loaf of. And then he sobbed, and then he fought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mr. Crumb. Mr. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice. I said I liked a... And then he stopped, and then he fought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat. Please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So he carrying his bread and his meat. Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped. Then he fought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he fought. And then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things that Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That was fun too. Chinese chess. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't any like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Warbletown are delighted, especially Mr. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy learned how to whisper. Okay, I finished the book. There is more Mr. Man book for you to read. If you like my video, subscribe and see you next time. Bye bye.